At how you can set up your Illustrator file to start to work towards something that you can cut out on the laser cutter. We are going to create a new file. You need to have a file artboard that will be the right size for the material that you're working with. If you're an idea to object and you're working with the construction paper, the black, gray, or white construction paper, we are working with a 610 millimeters by 450 millimeter landscape orientation, and that will work well for us. Since we are just cutting, we don't have to worry too much about the raster effects. You may want that to be 600 if you are working with images engraving into acrylic, but that's a different project. Once you create this, we also want to be able to see a few things. We want to be able to see the rulers. Command R will bring up your rulers. These should be in whatever units you set when you set up the file. If you aren't sure what your units are, you can go over to Illustrator Preferences and you can pull up units. Units, millimeters is what you want to work with. Stroke can be in points or in millimeters, and leave your type in points. That's like a 12-point font or a 14-point font, right? What you're used to thinking about when you're thinking about size of text. And the other thing that we are going to be looking at is your grids and your guide, depending on if you want to work with a grid or need to work with a grid for layout. Frequently, the default for your grid color is a gray so that it doesn't compete too much with the lines that you're working with. I'm going to work with it a little bit darker so that you can see the grid on the screen while I'm doing the screencast. You could also leave that at black if you wanted to. Let's do that. The guides are cyan here. This works well for most things. However, if you're working with a color design and it's mostly blues, you may want to change that to a different color. Everything else you shouldn't need to change too much. What is a guide? If you click on the ruler and pull down, you can pull down a guide and notice like that's at 100 millimeters in from the 0 point. So it's 100 millimeters down from the side going across. Let's say you needed to block out some areas like that. Or you can also take a look at view. We're going to add down here. We're going to show the grid, which if you see these little commands on the side, these are key commands. So command apostrophe will also bring up your grid and take it away if you want to see it and not see it easily. You may want to snap to grid. The other thing about the grid that I would like to do, let me go back to preferences for a moment. Grid to guide. I have adjusted this so that it's a grid line every 10 millimeters. So the emphasized ones are every centimeter mark and the subdivisions of 10. So I see millimeters and centimeters. The default is not this. So make sure when you set up your grid that you're doing it with your millimeter scale so that the increments that you're counting are the increments that you're probably thinking about in your head. So useful. And I'm going to go back here and show grid. There's my grid. And as you can see, now this is a fairly large, not quite A2 piece of material, and we have centimeter marks, and those are the millimeter marks in the slightly lighter gray. This will make it easier to line things up, make some estimations about how big it is that you're working, keeps you sort of reality-based. A couple of other things you might want to consider when you are working with shapes and sizes. Over here, let's go through the tools that you're going to use right off. This is your shape tool. Usually it defaults to the rectangle when you open a file. We also can use the circle, polygon. Those are the three you'll probably use most. You may end up using a rounded rectangle tool, depending on what shape you're working with. I'm going to start with a basic rectangle tool, though. If you click and drag, you can make any shape that you want. And you can see how this is like random, doesn't have to be a regular size, and it comes with a fill. Over here is your stroke color, is the black, this is the edge line, and the fill color is what's inside. We actually want to work without a fill, so we want to make sure that that has no fill, so that little red line right there. And a black stroke is a good place to start. You may end up color coding some things so you can see what you're working with, particularly if you have a couple of similar lines that are similar sizes but not exactly, and you need to know which ones are the larger ones and which ones are the smaller ones so you can make them fit together. Now, instead of just clicking and dragging a random size, if you are on the shape tool, and you tap, it will bring up a dialog box so that you can actually type in your dimensions. So let's say what I need here is a 60 millimeter square. You can set rectangular dimensions, whatever it is you need. And then to move this around, you want to make sure you're on your selection tool, not your direct selection tool. The selection tool lets you click anywhere on your object, but you do have to be on it and not just in it necessarily to move it around. See how this doesn't move anything? You have to be on that line to move it. Although once it's selected, you can also use your arrow tools, which are marvelous if you are snapping to the grid and getting something to line up precisely. And we want to remember, again, the snap to grid is going to be really useful if we're using some common dimensions. The direct selection tool will let you mess around a little bit where you can select just one point and do something really fun, or get rid of one point, or get rid of one path, the path between 2 points. These are ways that you can make some adjustments to the shape tool. So the shape tool isn't necessarily only going to be that square. It can be part of a tab, right? So if I then need, say for example, a 20 millimeter by 20 millimeter here, I can line that up. Oops, grab that, put this right here. Now, if I want this and that to be center aligned, I have this grid line is going through both. I can see that. We can line that right up so it's a 50-50 mix on either side. We can bring it up so that's going to snap to have the two paths overlap. You can see how they're exactly on the same, there's no gap between these two, right? So they're on the same grid line. If your shapes are on the same grid line, and I just clicked and dragged really quickly here to select both, you can then, using the shape builder tool, drag through two shapes to connect them. And you can do that with multiple shapes. Then if you are, say, interested in taking this particular shape and building this out this way, so that we have, again, that the size and shape of the tab that you might be working with, you could work that way. There's some regularity to this, so you know everything's matching and everything's even, and you're working in essentially 1 centimeter squares. You don't have to do the math for that diagonal because it's all set up for you. You may then decide that what you want is on top of that, this will be interesting, a circle or an oval that is going to be the right size. And you can kind of click in here, see how those points are going to overlap. Where is the center? The center of the circle is that blue dot, and again, it's lined up on the center guideline. If you knew you were going to be aligning a lot of things like that, I would probably bring over one of those blue guides, just make it easier to see, and then you can play with this. Now, once that's lined up, I'm not going to join these shapes. What I'm going to do is get rid of the parts of the oval that I don't need. So I'm going to go back to my direct selection tool, and I'm going to click down here on this path and delete that. Click off and then click back on. Get rid of that. Now I have this little point kicking around. I want to get rid of that point too. So don't leave anchor points just kind of laying around. But that might give you something of an interesting shape that you could work with if you are thinking to yourself, okay, what I really need is a slightly thinner slot for this to fit into. Right now, this folds over only halfway in and this folds over halfway in. So this doesn't actually need to be as big. So I could bring this over. So now ask yourself, is it feasible to then fold that across and fold that across and have it fit through that slot? Not enough. Maybe I need 8. That looks better. Like whatever those proportions are, just make that work. But make sure that if you fold it, it's going to, the point from the fold across is no wider than the gap itself. And then of course we want to get rid of this line because we want all of this to stay together. And then we can select that path and delete that, and all of a sudden we have something interesting going on in terms of a shape, depending on what you're trying to do. And then when you are looking at putting in the slots that you need to slide these into, you're going to want to make sure that in this case it needs to be whatever this solid distance is. Okay, so 16. So this is our 16 right here. Maybe what we're looking at is a 16.5 or a 17 millimeter slot for that to fit into. Well, let's see what a 1 millimeter differential does for us anyway. So if I tap, again, I get the dialog box. I can put in my 17 millimeters and I'm going to keep it flat, 180 degrees. And there's my line. I can zoom out enough and you can see that that is going to be about the right size for whatever that needs to slide into, right? I get a 0.5 millimeter on either side. And I could decide that I want them to overlap in a way where we, depending on how tall this is, I could put it that distance down here, then we'd have a lot of overlap, and this becomes part of a design element. Or if we put it closer to here, again, depending on the, and this is where, yes, we have snapped to the grid, which means I can't center this on here. This is also a case where if I want to align that to that center guide, if you click on it to select it, you can move it over by each increment of the grid by simply using your arrow tools. And sometimes that's easier than trying to grab something. If we know we need shape, copy, paste, there's my shape. And now I can reorient and attach it to various parts of the circle. Now, one of the things that you can do with transform is to rotate, and you can rotate 90 degrees and then place this over here. Again, if you feel like you need another center point guide, just to make that easier, you can see where you're going with that. There we go. And then I'm going to paste another one. And that one, I can rotate a 180 if I need to go in the other way. So just according to whatever your needs are. And then the key thing here is also going to be, remember to go back and take out that little section. Now, it's going to be a little bit more complicated than how we got rid of this one. So hang on for a sec. We can also, the other way you can do this, you can grab a corner, hold the shift key down, and if you hold the shift key down, it's going to move it in 45-degree increments, and you can just flip that right around there. So it depends on how you prefer to work. And again, zoom in and make sure that the center point is lining up on that guide, because it is super easy to have that not work. Let's say I want to do some shape building with this. We may run into some problems because this isn't a shape with the rectangle. Since we can't do that with the shape builder tool, we have to do one step before we use it for these. We are going to select all of the things that we're working with here. Make sure we get all of them. I don't necessarily want this slot to be a part of that compound path. If I want to deselect this piece, I can shift and click on it and it should deselect it. Or I can go over here and find this line and deselect it. All right, so that's select. That's the one I want to deselect. I'm just going to blink that for a second, which means that I'm not going to select it when I drag over the whole thing because you can't see it, right? Again, this might be a place where you decide you want group or subgroup your slots and your tabs separately. All right, so I have all these selected. I'm going to go into a compound path. I'm going to make a compound path. And that allows me to then, while they're still selected, go into Shape Builder and drag through the various things so that they are now a single compound path, right? And that whole thing is one compound path. Then if I want to bring this line back up to start to work with it, I have that there as well. One last thing before this particular shape is, I think, ready to cut. I want 1, 2, 3 more of those, and I want to put them, how far down did that go? This is where the grid is going to help. 1, 2, 3, 4 millimeters down from there and centered on the center grid line, guideline. 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'm just going to use my arrow keys and move that over. Great. And then these we can, again, hold the shift key down and we can orient very quickly to that 90 degrees. Put one there, grab another one, put it over here, and zoom in and make sure you are lined up and 4 millimeters down, because that's where we decided to put it, and 4 millimeters down and on the guide, and things look good. The other thing that you could do, depending on how much you want to play around, this kind of thing, you might decide that you also want, oops, shift key. You also want options here, or somewhere in this ballpark. Let's see what we would need to do to line up to center that. Does that mean the center point needs to be on the intersection? I'm not sure. 3 from there, 3 from there. That looks not so bad. This 3 millimeters is really narrow for a piece of paper. The problem is, as I bring this down, we get closer to being in line with the other one below it. You may decide that you want to try a couple there, and then, because again, this is a test thing. I'm going to bring this over here, and I'm going to do the same distance on both of those and see how that works. And I'll zoom in and align those in a sec. And then this one, that is going over here. I'm going to put them further in and see what that does to how things line up. I don't know if that's going to, it would change the capacity for over and under. Some things would have to be over and some things would have to be under, because you're going to run into some problems, I think, on where this runs into this when you start to unfold and pull things around. So I have it about 4 millimeters from the end of the other slot. This one is about that, just oriented slightly closer to the point as opposed to farther away from the point. So I have, this way I can test out a bunch of things with one shape, and I can cut out a couple of these and then see how they go together. Who knows? Hopefully that gets you far enough on making your shapes. I'm going to do a second one with circles, triangles, polygons. So this is screencast number 1.